The restaurant's chandelier gleamed above dozens of laughing guests, but my eyes were fixed on one table. Table 7. There she was. Grace. My wife. Sitting across from Kenneth, leaning in so close their shoulders almost touched. Her smile was gentle, her fingers twirling a glass of red wine, her eyes locked on him like he was her only world. I didn't belong in this scene, not as her husband, not as the man who built the life she was living. She had told me it was just a harmless ladies' night. She had even kissed me goodbye before leaving the house, telling me not to. Wait up. The lie was smooth, calculated, practiced, but not this time. I stood at the restaurant entrance, calm, composed. The small flash drive in my hand felt heavier than it should have. Weeks of surveillance, GPS tracking, private investigators, all compressed into this tiny device. The host, sensing the tension, glanced nervously at me as I handed him the flash drive. "Play it," I said coldly. Without a word, he obeyed. Within moments, the massive LED screen behind the bar flickered to life. The restaurant's background music faded as curious guests turned to watch. The first image appeared, a map with dozens of bright red dots marking locations and timestamps. Grace's entire secret life unfolded on that screen like a confession. She could no longer hide. Her car parked at Kenneth's luxury condo every Thursday night. The weekend getaways to private resorts she claimed were spa retreats. The late-night hotel check-ins. The trail was merciless. Each timestamp hit, like a bullet, exposing the months of betrayal she thought were invisible. The laughter in the restaurant stopped. The chatter died. Only the screen spoke now. Grace's hand froze mid-air, wine spilling onto the tablecloth as her eyes widened in horror. Kenneth stiffened, his fake smile vanishing as his face turned a sickly pale. Murmurs erupted among the guests, their gazes darting between the screen and the guilty pair, and then I stepped forward, my voice slicing through the heavy silence. "Grace, ladies' night. Was it? Funny. Because your GPS says otherwise." Her lips quivered, her face drained of color. But I wasn't finished. This was only the beginning. I met Grace 5 years ago, back when I was still foolish enough to believe that love was pure. I had just taken over my father's business empire after his sudden passing, a multi-billion-dollar corporation that left me both powerful and isolated. Most women approached me with hidden intentions, their eyes calculating, searching for cracks to exploit. But Grace appeared different. She was introduced to me through a mutual friend during a charity gala. She wore a simple white dress, nothing flashy, nothing desperate. Her voice was soft, her laughter genuine, or at least it seemed that way. While others were desperate to impress me with their knowledge of stocks, real estate, or the global market, Grace listened. She asked about my hobbies, my dreams, my childhood. She didn't chase my money. She chased me. At first, I kept my distance. I'd seen too many people change the moment money entered the equation. But Grace was patient. She never pushed, never demanded. She waited. Slowly, her kindness became a comfort. Her thoughtfulness turned into stability. She remembered small details about my daily routine, brought me homemade lunches when I worked late, and left handwritten notes tucked inside my briefcase. She made me feel seen in a world where everyone only saw my wallet. Within a year, I proposed. Our wedding was the event of the year. High-profile business figures filled the cathedral. Media outlets fought for coverage. But for me, standing at that altar, it wasn't about the cameras or the headlines. It was about her. I truly believed I had found someone who loved me for who I was, not for the empire I controlled. The first few years of marriage were blissful, or at least I thought so. Grace handled herself gracefully in public, winning over investors' wives, and making connections I never knew I needed. My board members praised her ability to smoothen negotiations with her charm. Business partners admired how grounded she was, despite being married to one of the city's wealthiest men. She became not only my wife, but my most trusted confidant. Then came Kenneth. He was my father's protege. Kenneth had worked his way up from nothing, earning a reputation for being sharp, ruthless, and endlessly ambitious. My father admired his work ethic, often referring to him as the son I never had. I brought Kenneth into the Joshua Group as a senior advisor after my father's passing, partly out of obligation, partly out of respect. At first, Kenneth maintained professional boundaries, but slowly, subtle changes crept in. The meetings extended into late-night discussions. The casual business lunches turned into weekend strategy retreats. And Grace, who once waited for me to return home, suddenly began attending these meetings as well. When I questioned it, she brushed it off with a gentle smile. "We're all just trying to secure the company's future," she said. "You trust me, don't you?" And I did. That trust was my second mistake. The cracks started small. Missing funds from minor accounts, financial reports that didn't match the raw data. When I raised concerns, Kenneth personally assured me everything was under control. Blamed clerical errors, inexperienced staff, and system glitches. And Grace? She stood beside him, echoing his explanations, gently convincing me to let it go. By the 4th year of our marriage, the distance between Grace and me was undeniable. Our conversations shifted from personal to transactional. She stopped leaving notes in my briefcase. The warmth in her eyes faded. My home became colder, not physically, but emotionally. Yet, every time I considered confronting her, she somehow disarmed me with a well-timed smile or a tender gesture. But instincts don't lie. One evening, after returning from a business trip, I noticed her phone buzzing repeatedly while she was in the shower. It wasn't locked. I glanced at the screen. Kenneth's name, followed by a string of suggestive messages. My chest tightened, but I didn't react. Not yet. I needed more than text messages. I needed undeniable proof. That night marked the beginning of my quiet investigation. I hired a private team, men I trusted completely, with no ties to my company or my personal circle. They followed her, logged her movements, tracked every location she visited, and recorded every meeting she had with Kenneth. What I discovered over the following weeks wasn't just an affair, it was a partnership. They were planning to strip me of everything I had built. They had already transferred assets to dummy companies overseas. They were forging acquisition documents to sell off my holdings without my consent. Grace had seduced not just me, but investors, suppliers, even a few board members. Kenneth orchestrated the entire scheme, using Grace's charm as his weapon while painting me as inattentive and distracted. I realized this betrayal wasn't recent. It had been years in the making. That's when the anger began to burn. But I didn't let it consume me. I didn't want a confrontation. I wanted a reckoning. So I laid my trap carefully. I created false vulnerabilities in the company. Rumors of debt, insider whispers of legal troubles, fabricated liabilities. Kenneth and Grace took the bait instantly, accelerating their theft under the assumption that I was too distracted to notice. Meanwhile, my private investigators collected more than enough evidence: financial records, meeting logs, hotel receipts, surveillance footage, and the GPS tracker installed in Grace's car. Tonight, I activated the final stage of my plan. Grace thought tonight was a private dinner between her and Kenneth. She thought I was at a charity gala across town. She thought her web of lies was still intact. But as the GPS logs flashed across the restaurant's screen, as the guests gasped and the silence crushed the air, she finally understood. Her game was over. Grace sat frozen as the GPS logs kept flashing across the massive screen. Each red dot told a story she could no longer rewrite. Her betrayal was no longer whispered in private. It was now displayed in front of strangers, business associates, and the very people who once admired her poise. Kenneth's jaw clenched as he scanned the growing audience of curious eyes. He tried to lean closer, whispering urgently into Grace's ear, but I saw the panic behind his composed facade. He knew the net was closing, and there was no elegant escape route left. I slowly approached their table, each step deliberate, letting the silence grow heavier with every second. The murmurs around us grew louder. A few people started filming, their phones raised discreetly as if documenting a scandal they knew would spread like wildfire by morning. I didn't mind. In fact, I wanted this to be public. I wanted everyone to see what they truly were. Grace finally found her voice, barely a whisper. Joshua, this isn't what it looks like. I stopped right beside her. My voice remained calm, almost gentle. Really? Then please enlighten me. Which part is confusing? The Thursday nights at Kenneth's condo? The weekend trips to private resorts? Or perhaps the offshore accounts you both opened in the Cayman Islands? Her face twitched, her composure cracking. Joshua, you don't understand. It was all business. Business? I cut her off. Stealing from my company. Laundering. Funds. Faking contracts, lying to my face for years. That's your definition of business? Kenneth straightened his back, attempting to regain some control. Joshua, you're blowing this out of proportion. We were securing investments. International. Expansion requires flexibility. You've been too rigid lately, too emotionally involved to make rational decisions. I turned my eyes to him, my expression sharp. Emotionally involved? You mean trusting my wife and my father's protege? That kind of emotion? He didn't answer. Instead, he glanced nervously toward the restaurant entrance where two men in dark suits appeared, blending into the growing tension like shadows. My private security. They stood quietly, observing, ensuring no one fled before the authorities arrived. Grace's tone shifted, her desperation seeping through. Joshua, I never wanted to hurt you. Kenneth manipulated everything. I was scared. I didn't know how to stop once it started. I tilted my head slightly. Scared? No, Grace. You weren't scared when you forged my signature. You weren't scared when you helped transfer millions out of my company. You weren't scared when you sold me out for weekend getaways and secret meetings. You were calculating. You thought I was too blind to see. Her lips trembled as tears welled up in her eyes, but this time there was no sympathy in me. Not anymore. Kenneth reached for his phone, but one of my security guards subtly shook his head, warning him. There would be no last-minute calls. No. Lawyers, no saviors. You had everything, Grace, I continued, my voice even. The house, the wealth, my trust. All you had to do was be honest. But you wanted more. You weren't satisfied being my wife. You wanted my throne. Grace's tears spilled over, her voice cracking. I loved you. I still love you. I almost laughed. Love? You don't love me. You love what I gave you. You loved the security, the power, the status. You loved playing the role of the devoted wife while stabbing me behind my back. Kenneth tried to cut in again, his voice steady but hollow. Look, Joshua, we can fix this. It doesn't have to end like this. We can negotiate. You don't want to drag the company's name through public scandal. Let's be reasonable. I faced him fully now, my eyes cold. Negotiate? You mean let you two walk away with everything while I pretend none of this happened? You forget who you're dealing with, Kenneth. This company doesn't belong to you. It never did, and the law doesn't negotiate with thieves. The atmosphere tightened. Every person in the restaurant watched in absolute silence, as if witnessing a stage play far more gripping than any drama they'd ever seen. Grace reached out suddenly, grabbing my wrist, her grip weak but desperate. Please, Joshua, we can start over. I was wrong. I see that now. I'll testify against Kenneth. I'll give you full access to every account. Just give me one more chance. I slowly pulled my arm away. There are no more chances. As the weight of her failure settled. She broke down completely, sobbing into her hands. The elegant, polished woman who once stood beside me in front of flashing cameras was now reduced to a trembling mess. Kenneth's composure finally crumbled as well. His voice rose in anger. Don't think you've won, Joshua. You're still vulnerable. When this goes public, investors will panic. The stock will drop. Your precious board will lose faith. You might take us down, but you'll ruin yourself in the process. I smiled faintly, leaning in close enough for only him to hear. You really don't understand, do you? I've already insulated the company. Every stolen dollar you moved was traced and frozen before you even realized it. By tomorrow morning, the only people under investigation will be you two. His face drained of color. I stepped back as two plainclothes officers entered the restaurant. The lead officer walked directly to Kenneth. Kenneth Wong, you're under arrest for corporate fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. Kenneth tried to resist, but the officers were swift. The cuffs locked around his wrist with a satisfying click. Grace screamed his name, but the officers had no sympathy. They simply read Kenneth his rights as they dragged him toward the exit. Grace dropped to the floor, her sobs echoing off the marble floors. She reached toward me again. Please, Joshua. I have nothing without you. I stared down at her with the same cold gaze that once held love, but now held only emptiness. Exactly. And then I turned and walked away, leaving her to drown in the weight of her choices. The sound of Grace's sobs trailed behind me as I left the restaurant that night, but I didn't turn back. I thought I would feel triumph. I thought the moment her mask shattered would be satisfying enough to erase the pain. Instead, as I stepped into the cool night air, there was nothing. No relief, no joy. Only silence inside me, like standing in an empty room long after the party has ended. For years I had imagined how this moment might unfold. I pictured her begging, Kenneth arrested, the world finally seeing their true faces. Yet now, having watched it play out exactly as I designed, all I could feel was exhaustion. It wasn't the execution of my plan that drained me, it was everything that led up to it. The years of deception, the constant second-guessing, the slow erosion of trust I once foolishly placed in her. The ride home was quiet. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, but my reflection stared back at me in the glass. My expression was calm on the surface, but beneath it was the heaviness of betrayal that never really leaves. No one truly prepares you for the kind of pain that comes from being betrayed not by an enemy, but by the person you once loved enough to trust with your entire life. I had given Grace everything: my home, my name, my loyalty. I remembered how proud my mother was when I introduced Grace to the family. She once pulled me aside, smiling, and whispered, "She's perfect for you, Joshua. She'll stand by your side no matter what." How naive we both were. The worst part wasn't even the affair. It wasn't even the money she tried to steal. It was how easy it had been for her to wear two faces, one for me and one for Kenneth. To wake up beside me every morning, kiss me goodbye, and then walk straight into his arms like none of it mattered. That's the part that left the deepest scar. As my car pulled up to the villa, I sat inside for a moment, staring at the gates. The property was massive, built with the same ambition my father once carried, but tonight it felt cold, hollow. A palace with no queen, a home stripped of warmth. The staff stood at attention as I entered, offering polite bows. I returned them with a nod but spoke to no one. In my private study, the weight of everything pressed down harder. The files sat stacked on my desk. All the financial reports, the surveillance logs, the transfer records that proved Grace and Kenneth's conspiracy. I had reviewed them dozens of times, and still part of me wished I would find some error, a sign that this had all been some massive misunderstanding. But every document, every timestamp only confirmed the truth. Even now, despite everything, there was a voice buried deep inside me that whispered, what if she had just confessed? What if she had come to you first? What if she had shown an ounce of remorse before getting caught? Would I have forgiven her? I didn't know the answer, and that uncertainty haunted me more than her betrayal. I poured myself a drink and sat by, the large window overlooking the city skyline. The lights twinkled like distant stars, indifferent to the chaos unfolding within my world. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Chloe. Chloe had been with the company for years. A sharp legal mind, fiercely loyal, never once crossing any boundaries despite her obvious feelings for me. She had stood quietly on the sidelines, watching as Grace played her game. She saw it all before I did, but never spoke unless I asked. "The transfer documents have been received," Chloe said, her voice steady on the phone. "All offshore accounts are frozen. The board has been notified. Kenneth's arrest has already hit the financial networks." "Thank you," I replied softly. There was a brief pause. "Joshua, are you all right?" I almost laughed at the simplicity of the question. Was I all right? What did all right even mean anymore? "I'm fine, Chloe. It's done. You know where to find me if you need anything," she added quietly, then ended the call. As the night dragged on, I allowed my mind to wander back to the beginning again. The charity gala, the first date, the wedding vows, the promises whispered, late at night. How could someone fake love so perfectly for so long? How could I, with all my business instincts, have been so blind at home? It wasn't just Grace and Kenneth who played me. It was my own arrogance, my own misplaced faith, that allowed them to build their scheme unchecked. I had built an empire, but failed to guard the one thing that mattered most: trust. The knock at the door came lightly. My butler peeked in. "Sir, the lead investigator from financial crimes called. Kenneth has requested to speak with you." I let out a long breath. Of course. Now that everything was crumbling, he wanted to negotiate. He wanted mercy. "Tell them I'll meet with him in the morning," I said. "Yes, sir." The door closed. Again, and I was left alone with my thoughts. In the distance, I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock. Time marched forward, indifferent, unforgiving. I knew the hardest part wasn't exposing them. It was living with what remained after the dust settled. The silence inside my home felt permanent now. The echo of Grace's laughter no longer haunted these halls. Even though I had won, it still felt like losing something far more personal than wealth or reputation, and yet beneath the exhaustion, something small flickered quietly inside me. Not joy, not satisfaction, but a seed of clarity. The game was far from over. Kenneth wasn't finished trying. Grace's desperation would only grow. There was still more they would lose before this ended. I hadn't come this far just to destroy them. I came this far to make sure they felt every ounce of what I once felt, completely, fully, and without escape. The following morning, I arrived at the Financial Crime Unit's holding facility. Kenneth was sitting inside a small glass-walled room, his hands cuffed to the table. Despite the circumstances, he still tried to maintain his composure. His suit was wrinkled, his hair unkempt, but the arrogance behind his eyes hadn't faded. If anything, he wore the look of a man who still believed he could negotiate his way out. The officer opened the door and motioned me inside. I sat across from Kenneth, meeting his stare without a word. The silence between us hung heavy for several seconds. "Joshua," he finally said, forcing a smile. "It's good you came. I knew you'd be willing to talk. We can still fix this." I leaned back in the chair, watching him carefully. "You still think there's anything left to fix?" "There's always something to fix. Look, you've made your point. You exposed us. You've humiliated Grace publicly. You've frozen the accounts. Fine, you win." His tone was casual, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "But dragging this out any longer won't help you. The board won't appreciate the company being in the headlines every day." I remained silent, letting him continue to dig his own hole. Kenneth leaned forward, lowering his voice as if offering me some great favor. "I'll give you full access to everything offshore, every transfer, every dummy company, every partner involved. In return, you drop the charges against me and Grace. We'll walk away quietly, and you'll keep the company clean. The press. We'll move on. No permanent damage." I stared at him for a long moment before finally responding. "Do you actually believe I care about damage control? You think this was about protecting my public image?" His lips tightened as he tried to read my face. I continued, my voice low and steady. You've misunderstood me, Kenneth. This was never about money. It was never about the company. This is about what you both stole that can't be bought back. He forced a chuckle. Come on, Joshua, be rational. This is business. No, I said sharply. You crossed the line from business to personal the moment you both decided to betray me inside my own home. The door behind us suddenly opened. Grace stepped inside, escorted by 2 officers. She looked thinner, her face pale, her eyes hollow. Yet even in her weakened state, she forced a smile the moment she saw me. Joshua, she whispered softly. I asked to see you. I glanced at the officers, who nodded and stepped back, giving us privacy but remaining close enough to intervene. Grace took a step closer, her voice trembling. I know everything's fallen apart. Kenneth betrayed both of us. He made me believe we could handle this together, but he manipulated me. I never wanted to hurt you. You were the only one who ever truly cared for me. I said nothing, my face unreadable. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a flash drive. This has the backup records, every transfer Kenneth made behind my back. He was taking more than you know. I'm giving this to you, Joshua. All I ask is that you protect me from the charges. Let him take the fall. He deserves it. Kenneth's eyes widened in fury. You lying snake! Don't you dare turn on me after everything we did together! Grace ignored him, keeping her eyes locked on mine. I made mistakes, but I was weak. I let him pressure me. I was afraid. But you can still protect me. Please. Her sudden shift was expected. I had always known Grace's loyalty was as thin as glass. The moment Kenneth's position weakened, she would abandon him to save herself. What neither of them realized was that I had already anticipated every desperate offer they would make. This was exactly where I wanted them, turning on each other. I calmly took the flash drive from her hand and placed it on the table, but I didn't respond to her plea. Kenneth was seething. His voice cracked as he shouted, You planned this. Together with him, didn't you? The 2 of you set me up. Grace spun toward him, her tone suddenly venomous. Don't you dare blame me. You were the one stealing more than you promised. You wanted to take over Joshua Group completely, not just siphon funds. You lied to me too. Kenneth laughed bitterly. You're unbelievable. When this all started, you said you hated Joshua. You said he was cold, distant, that you regretted marrying him. You begged me to help you escape from his shadow. And now you want him to save you? Grace's face flushed, but she didn't deny it. I stood up slowly, looking at both of them. 2 people who once conspired to destroy me now, reduced to nothing but desperate accusations and shattered alliances. Neither of you understands what loyalty means, I said softly. You were both so eager to betray each other the moment things went wrong, and you thought I would ever trust either of you again? I signaled to the officers. Take them both back. The prosecutors can sort through your confessions. The guards moved in. Grace's voice rose one last time. Joshua, please. You still love me. I know you do. I didn't even look at her as they were escorted out of the room. The courtroom was silent as the prosecutor laid out the evidence. Every forged document, every secret transaction, every offshore account Grace and Kenneth had constructed in their elaborate scheme was exposed under oath. Rows of journalists filled the gallery, their pens moving rapidly, capturing every detail that would headline tomorrow's news. Kenneth sat stone-faced at the defendant's table, trying to hold on to the last fragments of his pride. Grace sat beside him, eyes lowered, pretending to be fragile and remorseful. They no longer even acknowledged each other, their once carefully orchestrated partnership reduced to silent mutual contempt. The prosecution had done its job perfectly, but now it was my turn. I was called to the witness stand. As I stepped forward, Grace lifted her head slightly, her eyes searching for some softness in my gaze. Something she could still manipulate. Kenneth didn't even bother looking at me. He already knew what was coming. I was sworn in, and the prosecutor began. Mr. Joshua, could you explain to the court how you first became aware of the financial misconduct? I answered calmly. Roughly a year ago, I began noticing inconsistencies in our subsidiary financial reports. Minor discrepancies at first. But the more I investigated, the clearer it became that the problem was systemic. Orchestrated, not accidental. The prosecutor nodded. And who was directly responsible? I glanced toward Kenneth and Grace before returning my gaze to the jury. Kenneth Wong managed the transfers. Grace supplied him with authorization codes, company seals, and my digital credentials to make it possible. A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Grace's fingers gripped the edge of the table as her lawyer whispered urgently into her ear. The prosecutor continued, "Were you aware of their personal relationship as well?" I took a breath. Not initially. I trusted both of them implicitly. Kenneth was my father's protege. Grace was my wife. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was personal. Grace's lawyer stood quickly. Objection. Irrelevant emotional commentary. The judge waved it off. Overruled. Continue. Mr. Joshua. I locked my eyes on Grace now, speaking directly to her more than the court. Grace didn't simply cheat financially. She lived two lives. She played the role of a devoted wife at home, while secretly conspiring against me alongside Kenneth. They planned not only to steal my company, but to strip me of my position entirely, replacing me, erasing me. Grace opened her mouth, but no words came out. She wanted to protest, but knew she couldn't risk perjuring herself. The prosecutor handed the flash drive Grace had given me to the bailiff. Your Honor, this device contains full documentation, offshore accounts, wire transfers, meeting recordings, provided voluntarily by Mrs. Grace in exchange for leniency. The courtroom erupted again. The press scribbled furiously. The judge leaned forward. And does Mr. Wong dispute these records? Kenneth's attorney stood. Your Honor, we acknowledge the contents of the drive, but assert that Mrs. Grace was the primary architect of the scheme. Grace's head snapped toward Kenneth, her expression twisting in rage and betrayal. The prosecutor wasn't finished. Mr. Joshua, can you explain how you orchestrated your counter-investigation? This was the moment I had been waiting for. Once, I suspected their betrayal. I deliberately allowed the financial inconsistencies to continue. I created false vulnerabilities in the company's portfolio, made it appear we were exposed to regulatory audits and overseas liabilities. This bait convinced them to accelerate their embezzlement, thinking they could secure funds before any potential collapse. I paused, scanning the jury as I delivered my final blow. I also planted private investigators, hired external auditors, and inserted GPS trackers into Grace's personal and corporate vehicles. Every meeting she had with Kenneth was recorded. Every transaction was traced. I didn't simply catch them by accident. I led them into the trap. The silence that followed was heavy. Kenneth broke first, his voice loud, desperate. He's lying. This was entrapment. You manipulated us into making mistakes. The judge banged his gavel sharply. Order in the court. I turned to Kenneth, my voice calm. You didn't make mistakes, Kenneth. You made choices. Grace's voice cracked as she finally spoke. Joshua, I gave you everything. Even when it all fell apart, I tried to help you. I handed you the evidence. You handed me the evidence, I repeated softly. Not because you were loyal. You handed me the evidence to save yourself when you realized Kenneth couldn't protect you anymore. Her eyes filled with tears. Because I love you. I almost laughed. Love? You only love what I represent. You loved the luxury, the security, the influence. You never loved me, only my throne. The prosecutor closed his files. No further questions. The judge called a recess, but the damage was irreversible. The jury had seen enough. Later that evening, after the session ended, I returned to my villa. But I wasn't alone for long. Chloe arrived. She had been the only person who remained truly loyal throughout this storm. She had worked tirelessly behind the scenes, coordinating investigators, filtering the evidence, and ensuring every legal, move was calculated to perfection. "You did it," Chloe said softly as she stepped inside. I nodded, but said nothing. She studied me for a moment. "You don't look victorious." I sighed. "Victory isn't as sweet as you think, Chloe. When you lose someone you once loved, not to death, but to betrayal, it leaves a different kind of emptiness." She nodded gently, but didn't press further. That night, as I stared out over the city lights from my balcony, the full weight of it settled in. I hadn't simply defeated my enemies, I had dismantled an illusion that I once called my life. The woman I loved had never existed. Only the mask remained, now shattered beyond repair. The next morning, the verdict came in swiftly. Guilty on all counts. Kenneth was sentenced to 25 years for financial fraud, forgery, and corporate theft. Grace received 15 years, reduced only because of her cooperation at the end. Neither looked at me as they were led away, in cuffs. But even as they disappeared into the prison system, I knew this was not the true end of my war. The company needed rebuilding. My trust in people was shattered. My heart, though cold and hardened, still carried the ache of everything I had lost. That's when Chloe's voice gently broke my thoughts once more. "Joshua, there's still a future ahead, a better one. You just cleared away the poison." For the first time in months, I allowed a small smile. "Maybe you're right, but from now on, I build alone." And as the prison doors closed on Grace and Kenneth, the world turned its page while I started writing mine. 3 months after the verdict, the boardroom of Joshua Group was silent as I entered. The directors, once anxious and divided during the scandal, now sat in composed respect. Their eyes followed me, not with doubt anymore, but with certainty. The company hadn't just survived the storm, it was thriving. With Kenneth's influence eradicated and Grace's manipulations exposed, we were stronger, cleaner, and fully stabilized. The stock price had not only recovered, but soared as public confidence returned. Investors admired the transparency, and the media hailed my calculated handling of betrayal. I sat at the head of the long table, adjusting my cufflinks. Chloe stood beside me, organized as always, her quiet competence never wavering. She handed me the quarterly reports. Steady growth, diversified expansion, legal audits cleared. "Everything is secured," Chloe said softly. "We've recovered full control over all former assets and eliminated every shell company they created. The new compliance system is airtight." I nodded once. "Good." After the meeting, as the directors filed out, Chloe remained. She hesitated briefly, then spoke. "There's one more thing." She placed a thin manila folder on the table. I opened it. Inside were several photographs, financial ledgers, and confidential reports. Grace and Kenneth's lives in prison were detailed far beyond any standard public record. Private investigators had continued monitoring them under my instruction. Kenneth, stripped of his once polished arrogance, now worked inside the prison's textile mill, earning barely enough to buy soap. His reputation inside was even worse. The guards had no sympathy. The inmates saw him for what he was: weak, entitled, and easy to break. Grace fared no better. The woman who once graced charity galas and luxury banquets now scrubbed toilets under fluorescent lights in a state prison. She tried in the early days to manipulate the guards and prison staff as she had manipulated everyone in her past life. But in a world where wealth meant nothing, her charms failed instantly. Beatings, humiliation, and complete isolation followed. 3. We're living exactly as I intended. A slow erosion of dignity. A punishment far crueler than any swift sentence. But Chloe hesitated again. "Joshua, they're finished. You don't need to watch them anymore." I closed the file and looked at her. "I know. You've already won." I smiled faintly. "It's not about winning anymore. It's about ensuring they feel every day what they made me feel for years. Powerless." For the first time, She allowed herself to say what had been lingering. You could let it go. I turned my gaze back to the city skyline, illuminated by the glow of my empire. One day, maybe, but not yet. 2 weeks later, something unexpected happened. The warden from Grace's prison called my private office directly. She's requested to speak with you, he said. She claims it's urgent, I thought for a moment. Approve it. The next afternoon, I visited the prison, not out of sympathy, but to witness her final descent. Grace was led into the visitation chamber, her wrists cuffed, her once perfect posture now sunken. Her face was pale, hair chopped roughly, bruises faintly visible beneath her makeup-free skin. She still tried to sit with some semblance of dignity, though the chains rattled as she adjusted. When she saw me enter, her eyes filled with something between desperation and hope, as if she still believed she could reclaim control. Joshua, she whispered, voice thin but steady. Thank you for coming. I sat across from her in silence, letting her speak first. I've had time to think here, months, about everything I did, about you, about us. I said nothing. She continued, her voice quivering as she tried to gather some form of sincerity. I was weak. Kenneth played on my fears, my greed. I never stopped loving you, Joshua. Not really, but I became consumed by what I thought I deserved. Power. Control. I was wrong. Her hands trembled, and her lips quivered slightly. I still dream about our early years, the life we had. The man who loved me so deeply, who trusted me completely. I killed that trust, and I've paid for it every single day in here. She leaned forward slightly, tears pooling in her eyes. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I needed you to hear it. You didn't lose me, Joshua. I lost you. I see that now. I studied her face. Not the face of my wife. Not even the face of the traitor who betrayed me. But the hollow shell of a woman who once believed she could control everything and now sat as nothing. Why now? I finally asked, my voice calm but sharp. Because I want you to remember me at my lowest, she whispered, so you know I regret every second of it. I leaned forward, my voice quiet but razor sharp. You're right. You don't deserve forgiveness, and you never will. Her face collapsed, as if she had been holding onto the slimmest thread of hope. I watched that final flicker die in her eyes. But I'll give you one thing, I added, coldly. I will pay for your medical bills, your safety inside this prison, and whatever miserable scraps of dignity you can preserve, not because you deserve it, but because I want you alive. I want you to feel this every morning you wake up. I want you to carry the weight of what you did until your final breath. Tears streamed down her face. She didn't speak again. The guards led her away. As I exited the prison, the sun was setting. I stood for a moment in the fading light, breathing in the evening air, the weight in my chest lighter than it had been for years. When I returned to the villa, Chloe was waiting, as she often did these days. Is it over? She asked softly. Paused, staring out across my estate, where the city lights sparkled beneath the dusk. Yes, I finally said. It's over. She smiled, the first real smile I had seen from her in months. And now? I looked at her, something finally shifting inside me. Now, Chloe, I rebuild. Not for revenge. Not for anyone else. For me. For the first time, I wasn't chasing vengeance, I was finally free. And as the night closed in around my empire, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was my second chance, and this time, no one would take it from me.